Well, in Singapore's constant quest to find more space, the answers could increasingly lie out of sea.
That's right. In this week's Spotlight, Cheryl Lin looks at ideas that have been floated to unlock land on water.
You're looking at Southeast Asia's largest deep-water ocean basin. It's 60 meters long and 48 meters wide, and it would take water in 25 Olympic-sized swimming pools just to fill it.
So I'm currently standing at the base of this deep-water ocean basin, and as you can see, we're about 12 meters down. But that's not the deepest it can go. And this pit here is about 50 meters from the top, and that's about 16 stories.
This basin that's being developed by the Technology Centre for Offshore and Marine Singapore, or TCOMS, can be used to test anything that has to float or go very deep. With smart sensing and data analytics capabilities, and how it simulates actual oceanic conditions, the developers are calling it a breakthrough for testing.
We're looking at developing a more consistent physical numerical simulation that will give better understanding and more confidence, because we want to know the behavior of the real solution, not just the model.
Understanding the oceans to build floating structures that can withstand the onslaught of Mother Nature could be the answer to a perennial concern for Singapore: space. Over the years, Singapore has reclaimed around 150 square kilometers of land, about a quarter of its original size. Its next goal is a total land size of over 760 square kilometers by 2030. But land reclamation is getting less viable, observers say.
Covering our shoreline with sand is damaging the marine biosystem. 2, the water that is left unreclaimed is now very deep. Right? Not like before when it was less than 10 meters. Now we're talking about 25, 30 meters. So the cost for reclaiming those land with sand is going to be enormous.
You can build a floating structure in a very, very short time, which would mean that you can monetize the investment rapidly. Land reclamation takes you several years before you can build anything on it. Another thing is that floating structures are expandable and also can be easily removed.
These floating solutions are also resilient to rising sea levels. Naysayers might say going up or down can create space too, but building upwards is limited by height and loading restrictions. There's also a limit to how far you can go down safely. As an island surrounded by more than 190 kilometers of coastlines, proponents say floating is the way to go, and it's not as far-fetched as you may think. The world's longest floating bridge in the US measures over 2.3 kilometers. In the Netherlands, a self-sufficient floating dairy farm is being developed. In South Korea, a cultural complex made of 3 floating islands lies on the Han River. And right here in Singapore, our very own Marina Bay floating platform. Singapore's calm waters are an ideal place for floating structures, one expert says, adding that future forays should start with industrial uses.
For aging industries, like petrochemical projects, power stations, incinerators, all this, you can transfer them to the sea. You free up enormous amount of land. And with this land that you are opening up, you can use that for the 4th Industrial Revolution products.
Indeed, Singapore is already collaborating with Norway to study floating structures for energy storage or bridge foundations. Some ideas reach even farther into the future.
We're all familiar with megacities made up of individual buildings next to one another, but researchers at NUS have conceptualized entire cities that float on water, and that includes floating homes, farms, hospitals, and even prisons.
The project by an architecture professor and his students explores using oil rigs as floating settlements.
The idea of megacities is actually coupled with geopolitics. You have to belong to a particular country, and maybe this is the time when there's mass displacement of large communities, whether by politics or by global climate, global warming changes, that we would have to consider autonomous systems where people can actually take into their hands, set up their own communities.
They say that by 2050, over 6.5 billion people will be living in cities, and thus more sustainable settlements are needed. Putting urban life on floats is complex. To avoid polluting the water, these systems include wastewater treatment, energy generating, and food growing systems. But before all this can even be imagined, there are challenges for floating solutions. For one, the question of regulation. Would it be considered a vessel or a building? And who would be in charge?
It's neither here nor there. Let's create a new body that takes care of it, and that will, work together with the MPA and PUB and BCA and so on. So they can be on their own because they're special.
There's also the question of where to put these floating solutions.
To ensure the safety of the navigation of these ships, to provide for mooring spaces and bunkering anchorage spaces. So that leaves us with only very, very small sterile sea spaces around little islands and around certain parts of Singapore. But if MPA can zone this for some users, then I think all the proponents of floating solutions can come up with some proposals for the government to consider.
Equally key is that although the technology may be ready, the people may not be so accepting. Ultimately, experts say a floating future is not just the stuff of science fiction. Meanwhile, Landscarce Singapore is keeping its options open as the country's urban planning authority said it's looking out for opportunities above ground, underground, on land and in the sea.